Hello, students. I'm going to be talking with you about Reconstruction in Arkansas. And it's sort of a title or a general heading for this lecture is tumultuous and controversial. So we're going to get into Reconstruction in great detail over the next little bit. And before I get started, I want to make a little mention about my sources. Obviously, if you're taking me for this course, we have Arkansas Concise History or Arkansas Narrative History. The Concise History is the newer book that we have recently switched to for the intro class that I teach. Also with Fire and Sword by Tom DeBlack, and he authors the chapters on the Civil War and Reconstruction in the textbooks, several great articles over individuals and events from Reconstruction Arkansas on the Arkansas Encyclopedia Online. You have articles on the Militia War, the Baxter War, just a general overview article done by Dr. DeBlack, which is cited everywhere, over just the Reconstruction in general. So a lot of great encyclopedia articles there. There is a great website timeline. If you just Google Reconstruction Arkansas, it'll come up for you. It's just got a lot of real general blow-by-blow information, kind of compares and contrasts the U.S. to what's going on in the Reconstruction, which I'll do in this lecture. And then also there is a series of lectures done from a seminar by leading historians on the topic of Reconstruction in Arkansas at the Old State House Museum in YouTube. Now, if you're taking me for this course in spring of 2020 and barring all disaster or us switching our software, all of these items are in Blackboard or a similar type learning software available for you, or you can just look them up online. And I do definitely recommend with Fire and Sword. I recently had Dr. DeBlack sign my copy, and it's an excellent read, and I definitely use it for this part of the class. So Reconstruction is very interesting in Arkansas. It's very interesting period in the South. It's an interesting topic to teach about. This occurs from after the Civil War until 1877. Okay? And this really concerns the question of how do we let the states who just waged a war against us, against the Union, back into that Union, right? How do we let states back into the Union that we just fought a war with? It's a very profound question here in this time period following this event, this catastrophic event that's known as American Civil War. So, political Reconstruction. This deals with the process of determining how seceded states would resume their place in the reunited nation and who would control the political fortunes of those states. And you're going to see that this is going to shift and change. It's going to be sort of a tug of war at hand on who will control and who will hold the reins of the fortunes of the states in the South, like Arkansas. Economic Reconstruction. Okay, this concerns the attempt by black Southerners to establish economic viability in the free labor system, so no slavery, and by the Reconstruction government to reshape the South basically in the economic image of the North, but in the absence of the slave-based and plantation-based agricultural economy, or at least a free labor-based agricultural economy. Okay, so that is what economic Reconstruction is. Now, social Reconstruction, this will involve the process of determining how former slaves and freedmen, or freedmen and former masters would interact with one another in society, right? There are going to be a lot of little things we'll talk about moving forward on that topic, but there are going to be new social arrangements that are made, some that are forcibly made, and then some that are manipulated that get brought on by the conclusion of the war and emancipation. So one thing that is very important to note, okay, is that in Arkansas, Reconstruction starts before the actual end of the Civil War, okay? So I'm going to get into that a little bit more as I overview this period from when for the most part, much of the activity of the Civil War, major battles have kind of run their course, right? So that is why you see Reconstruction starting to occur before the Civil War has ended nationally. So let's recap a little bit. 1862 to 1865, okay? This is when we're going to see John S. Phelps appointed military governor, okay? John S. Phelps. And he is appointed military governor of Arkansas by Abraham Lincoln in July of 1862. January 1863, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which in word freed the slaves in the Confederate States, right? Now, April 18th, 1863, you have Jacob G. Foreman and Samuel Sawyer appointed supervisors of Freedmen's Affairs in the Helena area, charged with the task of leasing abandoned plantations and hiring freedmen to work. Now, position military governor of Arkansas is abolished on July 9th of 1863. Little Rock falls to federal troops September 10th, 1863. And in December of 1863, we have 12 teachers from Chicago commissioned by the American Missionary Association to open schools for freedmen in Little Rock, Helena, and Pine Bluff. These will be segregated schools. And on December 8th of 1863, and I'll talk about this more in a moment, Lincoln presents the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction to Congress, calling for a full pardon and restoration of property for all but the highest political and military leaders of the Confederacy. This was a form of presidential reconstruction commonly known as Lincoln's 10% plan. Okay. Now, let me kind of overview the stages of Reconstruction in Arkansas. Okay. You have 1864 to 1868. All right. This is going to be when Isaac Murphy, lone holdout against secession of Arkansas, is governor from 1864 to 1868. We're going to talk about each one of these in detail. 1866 to 1868 is a period of conservative resurgence. This is when Confederate officials come back to Arkansas, a militia war will take place, and a former cavalry commander named Clayton is elected 9th governor of Arkansas and the first Republican governor of Arkansas. In 1868 to 1872, this time period, I will break this up a little bit as we discuss it. But this is termed Republican and Radical. This is when Clayton is governor for the first term. Then he decides to run and gets elected to the Senate. And he is going to, his exodus is going to initiate a schism in the Republican Party, 1872 to 1874, which we'll discuss. It is known as the Baxter War. So let's get into presidential Reconstruction in Arkansas. Let's follow up a little bit more on that 10% plan and go into what Abraham Lincoln's ideas are before his assassination. So Lincoln has a pretty lenient approach in dealing with Reconstruction in Arkansas. He wanted to make it an easy transition to allow the southern states to re-enter the Union with as little amount of obstacles and barriers as possible, a little amount of trouble for them to come back in. Now, he believed it was illegal to secede, so he offers a full pardon with restoration of all rights of property except as to slaves, to all rebels who would take an oath of future loyalty to the Constitution and agree to abide by the acts of Congress and presidential proclamations which are regarding slavery. Now, high-ranking Confederate officials would be dealt with on an individual basis. Now, when the number of people taking an oath in a state reached 10% of the people who had voted in the election of 1860, those citizens could form a new state government which the president would recognize. So the government we're talking about is the government of Isaac Murphy. It's a unionist government. So by January 1864, 10% requirements met in the state of Arkansas. January 4th, 1864, the Constitutional Convention of Arkansas Unionist convenes in Little Rock. March 14th, 1864. Arkansas's third constitution is drawn up under President Abraham Lincoln's Reconstruction Plan. And on April 11th, 1864, a Unionist state legislature is convened and Isaac Murphy is inaugurated as Arkansas's Unionist governor. Now, Isaac Murphy, again, he is a lone holdout against secession in 1861 from Madison County. And he will be governor for this 64 to 68 time period during the very end of the war on through into the first years of Reconstruction. Now, Elisha Baxter, who we will talk about much more later on here, and William Fishback are elected to the Senate. Now, when these two guys get to Washington, to the U.S. Senate, they present their credentials, and senators uncomfortable with Lincoln's policy refuse to seat them. So you have this weird issue where the Murphy government is recognized by the president, but not by Congress. Now we're going to talk about congressional Reconstruction, and you'll understand a little bit more about that here in a moment. Now Murphy notes in his inaugural address that the loyal state government began under very, very embarrassing surroundings, without money power, without military power, end quote. Now, from 1864 to 1868, when Murphy is governor, he enters into office while a large percentage of the state is still occupied by Union forces. Okay? By summer of 1864, more than 3,500 freedmen are working on leased plantations throughout Arkansas. That's something that's going on. And in April of 65, Lincoln is assassinated. Okay, so that's going to spell out some problems for Reconstruction in the South. It's going to bring into this conversation about that we were mentioning about congressional Reconstruction. Now, Lincoln's assassination removes this lenient plan of Reconstruction and makes any hopes of peaceful unification and realignment of southern and northern states nearly impossible. And Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, pursues a similar plan. He's going to repudiate repudiation of secession and the Confederate debt will be one tenet, the abolition of slavery, ratification of the 13th Amendment. But we're quickly, Andrew Johnson's quickly going to find himself at odds with congressional Republicans. And we'll talk about a split in the Republican Party, even in Arkansas. There's also concern about Confederate troops returning to oppose Unionists who were attempting to lead the state government. All right, so we'll talk about that issue as it rises. The state legislature passes a law requiring a second loyalty oath as a prerequisite for voting, right? So this is going to be very controversial, right? We're going to talk about one of these problems that arises is over former Confederates who are returning home being denied the right to vote. So we'll come back to that. So former Confederates being disqualified, fewer than 7,000 voters cast ballots, right? Now, the National Congress cites low voter turnout, and that's when you see them refusing to seat these newly elected congressmen, okay? Now, Reisen v. Farr, this is when the state Supreme Court in Arkansas strikes down the state's loyalty oath as unconstitutional. That loyalty oath was known as the Ironclad Oath, and that had been passed by the 64 Unionist legislature. And the measure sought to deny the ex-Confederates the right to vote. It is overturned December 13th of 65, so not long after it had been put in place. Now, in December of 65, the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution is ratified, abolishing slavery and involuntary servitude, except if you're being punished for a crime. Also, and this is in Pulaski, Tennessee, and I'll talk much more about the Klan in a moment, but the Ku Klux Klan is being organized in December of 65 in Pulaski, Tennessee. Now, conservatives began preparing an all-out effort for the next election in August of 1866, and intimidation and violence were used against both blacks and Unionists. We'll talk about this intimidation and violence and sort of political violence and social terror that reigns in this period of 66 to 68 and even beyond. So what's a conservative? Conservatives are a political faction composed of pre-war Democrats and some former Whigs who opposed the Republican Party in Arkansas's plan for Reconstruction or even in Congress. Now, former Confederates bore out the worst fears of Arkansas Unionists. Confederate candidates swept away almost the entire Unionist ticket that had been elected in 64. And conservatives seemed certain to recapture those two offices in 1868. So, former Confederates are returning to power in many counties. Now, the new legislature, however, passes no restrictive labor laws, such as the infamous Mississippi Black Codes. Now, that's just labor laws. Now, it neither did it permit African Americans the right to vote, hold political office, serve on jury, marry whites, or have access to public education. Now, in 1866, black codes are enacted by legislatures across the South. This is done to limit freedoms of African Americans, okay? These laws varied from state to state, but generally prevented African Americans from owning land, serving on juries, suing or testifying against whites. The codes also instituted strict vagrancy laws and often manipulated African Americans into unfair labor contracts. We'll talk about labor contracts later. Now, Arkansas does prevent African Americans from voting early on, serving on juries or in the militia, and attending schools with or intermarrying with whites. Okay. Now, in 1866, Arkansas freedmen did have the right to legal marriage, owning property, and entering into legal contracts. Okay. So they can do more than ever before. Now, two Confederates, former Confederate Senator Augustus Garland and another, are chosen to represent Arkansas in the U.S. Senate. Now, that body refused to seat Garland or any other senator from former Confederate states. Now, all classes are hit hard by the war, but some of the wealthiest citizens are actually able to maintain their fortunes. We'll talk about that as we mention Lakeport Plantation in a moment. Now, historian Carl Moneyhan notes that the loss of their slaves had a major economic impact on these antebellum elite. Now, this is a quote. So, the loss of their slaves had a major economic impact, but they were still in a better position than others to reestablish their lives and fortunes. Poor individuals and families did not have as much to lose, but their losses were most disastrous, also often involving everything. End quote. Land was a major form of wealth in the state. Okay, so land as a commodity is what the social, political, and economic power in Arkansas are all based upon. If you wanted to survive economically, you must maintain control of the land and reassert control over the labor force in some way. Now, we see this trend where a majority of freed men remain on the land that they had previously lived and worked on. Okay, they sought to gain for themselves a share of the state's agricultural bounty in which they had so long contributed to. Now, the issue is that they are agricultural workers, right? And that is what often in this position, many of them continue doing, is being involved in agricultural work. Some, however, do seek opportunities in cities. Now, General EOC Ord, O-R-D, he is the head of the military district that includes Arkansas. We'll talk about these military districts more in a moment. Now, Ord proposed using confiscated lands in giving those lands as homesteads to freedmen. Now, Congress refuses this idea and returned lands to the previous owners once they received a presidential pardon. This is going to be wealthy plantation owners, people that own, a lot of acreage. Now, planters managed to maintain ownership of their land and were in a strong bargaining position with the freedmen. They did have to negotiate with their former slaves for their services as agricultural workers. And a wide variety of arrangements are made. One planter notes that, quote, on 20 plantations around me, there are 10 different styles of contracts, end quote. Sharecropping becomes a very dominant arrangement. This is a system in which a tenant farmer will give a portion of his crop to a landowner for the right to farm a parcel of land. They would be furnished with everything to make a crop. The owner received a share of the crop as rent. If croppers provided tools, animals, they would be given a larger portion or larger share. Now, the hope is that a sharecropper could eventually save enough to purchase his own land and become an independent farmer, okay, which we rarely see happen. Now, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, or the Freedmen's Bureau, supervises these contracts between planters and laborers, these freedmen who are these agricultural workers. This is established by Congress on March 3rd of 1865, just before Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. Now, under the leadership of Major General Oliver O. Howard, okay, this is when 79 local Freedmen's Bureau agents are assigned to 36 locations around 30 different towns, which are all located southeast and west of Little Rock, at sites close to rivers and large freedmen populations. And these agents aided freedmen and white refugees of the war in Arkansas. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau is a federal agency that is charged by Congress with negotiating these labor contracts, also doing things like providing medical care, setting up schools, and solving land disputes for former slaves. The success of the Bureau depends on the actions and mindsets of these local agents and their racial attitudes and ideologies, which vary. Some are humanitarian, some were just downright racist. Some worked for the freedmen and freed women, and some were little more than labor agents representing the planters. After the war, a good crop season can make all the difference. It could turn the economy and the fortunes of a lot of people to boom or bust. So let's talk about what the economy was like in 1866, 1867. So, heavy rains in late spring of 66 cause severe flooding of major rivers. There's midsummer drought, there's heavy rains again in the late summer, and there's an infestation of worms which strip cotton plants bare. It kills the harvest. It's well below what is needed for Arkansas to be able to turn their economic fortunes around. This happens again the following year. Okay. Cotton prices collapse. When cotton prices remain lower, farmers found themselves in an ever-deepening cycle of debt that would continue well into the next century. The Gazette wrote this, quote, "The day of making sudden fortunes in the agricultural pursuits has passed," end quote. Now, on April 9th of 1866, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is enacted, which defines United States citizenship and stated that all citizens should receive equal protections under the law. May 1st through 3rd of 1866, a couple of things. This is in Memphis, regionally, just our neighbor here, and right on the Mississippi. A race riot breaks out in our region, and at the end of June, a race riot breaks out in New Orleans, Louisiana as well. And in June of 1866, the Southern Homestead Act was signed into law. Among freed slaves and poor whites, this is the demographic that Andrew Johnson is trying to improve land ownership for, okay? This does open up 46 million acres of public land for sale at reduced prices, but it's repealed in 1876. But in Arkansas, freedmen, their families are settled on 116 tracts of land during the act's existence. So that is a definite thing worth noting. Lakeport Plantation. I mentioned Lakeport a moment ago. Dr. DeBlack, he wrote his PhD dissertation on Lakeport and is, to my knowledge, working on publishing a book in his retirement on Lakeport. So, Lycurgus Johnson of Lakeport Plantation in Chico County survived somewhat better than many other planters. He held on to the majority of his 4,600 pre-war acres, much of his labor force. Now, Lakeport had been built in the 1850s by Johnson. It was a 17-room house and a showplace of the state's cotton aristocracy. Now, we talked about the 1850s being the time when cotton production is booming. By 1860, Johnson owned over 4,000 acres of rich Delta land and 155 total slaves. And the plantation produced 1,300 bales of cotton and 10,000 bushels of corn. So, some stats there on Lakeport. Now, a local Freedmen's Bureau agent reported that Johnson did his 100 hands, quote, the fullest justice. And he was referred to as, quote, a model man of Chico County, end quote. Now, Johnson is a post-war success story. Not all planters are. Historian Moneyhan states, quote, nature and the price of cotton were critical factors in the state's post-war economic life, but the decision of Arkansas in 1866 to emphasize cotton helped tie their farms to a crop that languished for the next 100 years and left Arkansas a legacy of poverty, end quote. So let's get into congressional Reconstruction. Okay, this is going to be our next sort of heading and major topic. Now, the plan for congressional Reconstruction was embodied in the Military Reconstruction Act. This passed over a presidential veto in March of 1867. This is also known as the First Reconstruction Act. This act divides the former Confederate states into 5 military districts under control of a military officer who had been authorized to keep order and protect the rights of the freed men. Military tribunals are in place of civil courts. And this act further specified that new state constitutions, which provided universal male suffrage, would be drafted, approved by a majority of the state's voters, and accepted by Congress. State legislatures were required to ratify the 14th Amendment, and persons were required to swear an ironclad oath that they had not aided or abetted the Confederacy in order for them to be able to participate. Okay? And again, this is the Military Reconstruction Act, or the First Reconstruction Act, passing in March of 1867. In November of 1867, Arkansans who had been disenfranchised under the First Reconstruction Act, okay, voted to hold a constitutional convention and elect delegates. 8 of the elected delegates are African American. Now, the Second Reconstruction Act is passed, specifically directed the military commanders to register all adult males who would take the oath. A Third Reconstruction Act follows in July, empowering military commanders to replace state or local officials. Arkansas and Mississippi constitute the fourth of the 5 total military districts. And again, I mentioned this earlier, Arkansas is under the command of General E.O.C. Ord. E.O.C. Ord. He is the former assistant commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau in Arkansas. Now, Governor Murphy was allowed to remain in office while this is going on, and he works closely with Ord for the remainder of his term after this Third Reconstruction Act. Now, the Third Reconstruction Act placed great power in the hands of those officials who registered voters enabling them to disqualify not only those who clearly fell under the prohibitions of the 14th Amendment, but also many who were only suspected of disloyalty. So a lot of controversy in arguing and disenfranchised voters there. It just depend on who you talk to about whether or not that was a bad thing. Being the individuals, if you're a disenfranchised voter for being a former Confederate, I kind of can get that. Now, should there be some sort of path for you to regain your right to vote? Maybe. What if you're just somebody who was just accused, though, and you really have no sympathies or loyalties to the Confederacy? And these are the things that there's all these factions that sort of exist and that make this very complex, okay? So let's talk about the conservative resurgence. Okay, this will be the time period from 66 to 68. So conservative resurgence, Republican Reconstruction, and the Militia War, 1866 to 1868. Now, this is when Confederate officials come back to Arkansas. Elections are held on August of 1866, and due to the Ironclad Oath being overturned in the state, ex-Confederates gain control over much of the state, including the legislature. They will refuse to ratify the proposed 14th Amendment of the Constitution. That's kind of the highlight of this general time period, 66 to 68. Now, this conservative legislature, composed of many of the antebellum's elite, passed the first state law providing for tax-supported public schools, so good for them. However, these schools were limited exclusively to whites. Now, we'll see a former federal cavalry officer, Clayton, elected as Republican governor under the Constitution of 1868. And with the election of 1868, Clayton is elected governor, and the Republicans do sweep some different positions statewide. Now, one thing that goes on is there's going to be a militia war. There's going to be a lot of chaos going on in Arkansas. And I've referred to this title as White Terror and Martial Law, the Klan in Arkansas. Now, a major problem that begins to rise during the Murphy administration that will be experienced and cause serious issues for the Clayton administration is the widespread violence throughout the state and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. I'll be talking about the Klan a lot moving forward. Now, this had been founded by Confederate veterans as a secretive social fraternity in Pulaski, Tennessee in the spring of 1866. Textbook definition, the textbook I use is the Ku Klux Klan, a secretive organization founded originally as a social fraternity by Confederate veterans in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1866. The Klan became a terroristic organization that functioned as a paramilitary arm of the conservative Democratic Party during the Reconstruction era, attacking freedmen, government officials, and Republicans. This group was dedicated to the preservation of white supremacy. They used terroristic tactics. They intimidated people. They killed African Americans, Republicans, and other Unionists all throughout the South. It is in April of 1868 that the first Klan is seen in Arkansas. Now, after the war ends, a constitutional convention takes place in 1868. There are a total of 70 delegates at the convention. The new convention for the state, a new constitution at this convention for the state is to be drafted. And this is where I mentioned this earlier, just in relation to African Americans. 8 African Americans are elected. William Gray, an articulate African American delegate, is the foremost spokesperson at this time for granting civil rights to African Americans. Now, additional delegates, 17 outside white unionists. We call these people also carpetbaggers. This group dominates Reconstruction in Arkansas. These people came to the South after the war to prosper from the defeated conditions that plagued the South. Additional delegates, 23 white unionists, scalawags. These are Southerners who bought into the Republican administration, right? These are people who are going to be definitely targeted by the Klan. This is going to be the numerically superior number of delegates. You have 17 white conservatives. This group dominates Reconstruction in Arkansas. They were better organized, with more dominant personalities in their group. There were also 5 Southern non-aligned members. African Americans voting, African Americans, and the disenfranchisement of former Confederates all make race a very dominant issue at this convention. Now, in Arkansas, the rise of the Klan coincided with the beginning of a massive campaign of terror and violence in all but the northwestern counties of the state, which begins in 1868. And this is, again, going to be as Isaac Murphy is going out of office and Powell Clayton is coming into office. It is estimated that more than 200 Arkansans were murdered on the eve of the 1868 election. Now, in June of 1868, Arkansas is readmitted to the Union, and Clayton will be elected governor in July. In September of 68, Simpson Mason, a Freedmen's Bureau agent, is killed by Klan members in Fulton County. Many agents suffered serious threats, intimidations, physical violence, you name it, all in Arkansas. Now, Thomas Hindman, formerly a Democratic congressman and a definite fire eater and Civil War Confederate commander, we talk about Thomas Hindman a lot in Civil War. He is assassinated in September of 68. On October 22nd of 68, James Hines, a Constitutional Convention delegate and Republican congressman from Arkansas, is murdered by a Klan member in Monroe County. Conservative leader and former Confederate senator, I mentioned earlier, Augustus Garland, he had personally intervened along with Clayton to try and end racial and political strife in Conway County, one of the state's most troubled regions in the post-war years. Clayton employed a dozen undercover agents to infiltrate the Klan and report on their activities. Of these agents, one was murdered when his identity was revealed. Clayton sent agents to purchase guns in the North to deal with this issue. In October of 68, the guns were delivered to Memphis, but the steamer, known as the Hesper, was chartered to deliver the weapons to Little Rock, was run aground by another vessel on the Mississippi River below Memphis, and masked men boarded the vessel, seized its cargo, confiscating and dumping its contents into the river. Clayton declared martial law following this in Ashley, Bradley, Columbia, Lafayette, Mississippi, Woodruff, Craighead, Greene, Sevier, and Little River counties, proclaiming them to be, quote, in a state of insurrection, end quote. this is going to be the beginnings of the Militia War. So the declaration of martial law and the subsequent activities of the militia constitute one of the most controversial aspects of Reconstruction in Arkansas. Now, martial law is the imposition of military government over a designated area, usually for a temporary period of time during an emergency situation when the civilian government is unable to maintain essential services for the constituents. So for 5 months, there are violent clashes between the militia and the Klan and Klan sympathizers that take place in southeast, southwest, and northeast regions of the state. Clayton is bombarded by complaints of theft, rape, and other abuses of the militia forces. The evidence of depredations by the militia is so widespread and so pervasive that it cannot be discounted. Clayton appointed his own officials to investigate some of these charges. And Clayton refuses to end martial law in a county until he is convinced that law and order has been restored there. Civilian authority was restored to the Southwest District in mid-January of 1969. One man of note, D.P. Upham, he is a Republican politician, plantation owner, and militia commander following the Civil War, who leads a successful militia campaign against the KKK in the Militia War. Now, Clayton's declaration of martial law and the deployment of the militia, combined with the desire of many law-abiding Arkansans of all political persuasions to return to law and order, contributed to a rapid decline of the Klan in Arkansas and the restoration of some civility in the state. Historian Eric Foner notes, scores of suspected Klansmen were arrested. 3 were executed after trials by military courts, and numerous others fled the state. By early 1869, order had been restored and the Klan destroyed. Alan Trelease argues that Clayton, quote, accomplished more than any other Southern governor in suppressing the Ku Klux Klan conspiracy, end quote. So some interesting notes about the Militia War there. Now, this is going to bring us to our last major topic. Okay, this is going to be the Baxter War. Now, I'm going to be lifting a title that Dr. DeBlack used when he gave a presentation recently at the Old State House Museum in 2017, I believe it was. Now, this is about the Baxter War, but also about the Republican schism in Arkansas. So, the title of the Baxter War that Dr. DeBlack went with is Brindle Tales, Minstrels, Hercules, and Lady Baxter. The Baxter War and the end of Reconstruction in Arkansas. Okay, so this event will bring us to the end of Reconstruction. Now, Dr. DeBlack refers to this event as both, quote, confused and confusing. And the Baxter War is a very unique event in Arkansas history, as well as the Reconstruction of the United States, just as a broader topic. Now, let's get into a little bit more background with Pal Clayton and what's going on politically at the time. Now, as early as the late 1860s, there was a schism in the Republican Party in Arkansas. There's a regular Republican wing. Okay, and this is led by Pal Clayton as governor. Now, Clayton gets elected to the Senate in 1871 after seeing the coming storm and just having dealt with a lot in his first administration. Now, there's also the insurgent wing. These are liberal Republicans. Now, Reconstruction Arkansas was being controlled by carpetbaggers, or people who had not been there before the war. Now, the insurgent wing is led by Joseph Brooks. from Cincinnati. Now, let's talk about this Republican schism and the Brooks-Baxter War from 1872 to 1874. Powell Clayton is governor. He's elected under the Constitution, the new Constitution, 1868. He's the first Republican governor of the state. He's inaugurated on July 2nd of 1868 and serves from 68 to 71 as the 9th governor of Arkansas. Now, a schism is a split or division between strongly opposed sections or parties caused by differences in opinion or belief. So we're talking about this period of Republican schism. Now, Clayton is a former federal cavalry officer from Kansas. He has a reputation, actually, as the best federal cavalry officer west of the Mississippi. Now, after the war, he purchased a cotton plantation near Pine Bluff. It was actually before the end of the war when he makes that transaction. Clayton was also a Democrat before the war, and he turned from his party due to their violence and hostilities towards African Americans. He viewed Reconstruction in Arkansas as a continuation in the war, which in many, many ways it really, truly was. Now, voting restrictions are in place when Republicans take over. Former Democrats who served with the Confederacy are disenfranchised. Okay, now, Clayton expanded the power of the governor's office, and he has numerous goals. He put an end to widespread violence in the state. He implemented the Republican program of protection of civil and political rights of black Arkansans. And he is attempting to rebuild the state's economy and to something viable and lasting. And he's also trying to build up the Republican Party in Arkansas. His entire plan for economic development becomes known as the Gospel of Prosperity. Now, Clayton is able to increase the amount of railroad track in the state from 65 miles immediately following the war to 662 miles during his time as governor. Now, the Constitution of 1868 in Arkansas, black males are guaranteed the right to vote, equality of all persons before the law, forbade depriving any citizen of any right, privilege, or immunity on account of race, color, previous servitude. To establish a free system of public education. To provide for a creation of a state university, which happens. Reappropriated election districts. Greatly strengthened the power of the governor, which Clayton really uses to his benefit. And expressed support for the continuation of the Freedmen's Bureau. Also petitions Congress for $3.9 million to help rebuild levees on the Arkansas and Mississippi River. Okay, so this is some of the highlights of the Constitution that Clayton is operating under during his time in office. Now, a couple of photos that I have featured in the PowerPoint I used for this section from Harper's Weekly about the Freedmen School. This is from June of '68. It's a great primary source. It depicts a Freedmen School. Many of these were conducted in churches. Another famous drawing from this publication on November 6th, 1867 is called The First Vote. This is the, if you note, the third person pictured in line there is wearing a Union uniform, a blue federal uniform. Harper's Weekly also depicts the KKK and Klan members in disguise in a December issue of '68. Another depiction in '72 shows an African-American family being threatened by Klan members with a rifle being pointed through their doorway. Now, conservative white Southerners did not like all of these changes we've been talking about. And that is one of the things that really leads to the spread of the Klan throughout the South. Now, Clayton is governor from 68 to 71. A few more things about Clayton, just that we haven't got into. And talking about sort of the succession going from Clayton to the next governor. Okay, getting into this topic of the Brooks-Baxter War. Now, Clayton is originally from Kansas. He'd fought in Arkansas, and he was distinguished as a Union cavalry officer. He fought at Helena. He fought at Pine Bluff. Originally, as we talked about, a Democrat. But as him seeing the atrocities committed against African Americans in the Pine Bluff area after the war, saw him become active in the creation of the Republican Party in Arkansas. Now, Clayton and Murphy are very different. Murphy wanted to reconcile everyone and bring them back together. Clayton is very confrontational. Now, Clayton realizes that when restrictions are lifted on Democrats, that they will be a potent political force and they will toss Republicans out. So Clayton serves his one term as governor, realizes when the restrictions are lifted that he's going to have to contend with these Confederates, and he pursues an open Senate seat in 1871. He had the support of many conservatives who wanted to see him leave the state. And this leads to a contested election in 1872 between Joseph Brooks and Elisha Baxter. And that conflict will be known as the Brooks-Baxter War. So Joseph Brooks leads the liberal or insurgent wing of the Republican Party. He is born in Cincinnati in 1831. He is a licensed Methodist preacher at the age of 18, a circuit rider in Virginia, Iowa, and Indiana. In 1856, in St. Louis, he becomes the editor of Central Christian Advocate, a Methodist anti-slavery paper. And this gives him a forum to discuss his abolitionist views. He comes to Arkansas in 1863 as a chaplain of a Union African-American regiment led by his brother, Colonel William Brooks. His brother, William Brooks, is killed at the Battle of Helena. Joseph Brooks remains in Phillips County after this and after the war and began making money in the cotton business. He's a strong advocate for full civil rights for African Americans. Now, he's originally a Clayton partisan, but fell out due to perceived corruption. He becomes the leader of the liberal Republican element in the state. This mirrored what's going on the national stage with Horace Greeley. He had a good speaking voice. He's a powerful speaker. People quote said he had a voice like an old brindle-tail bull. His followers were called the Brindle-tails. In 1871, he announces his candidacy for governor. In 1872, and in May of 72, the Liberal Republican Convention in Little Rock made him their nominee. And this is a biracial convention. His campaign in June of 72 starts with a speech in the yard of the old State House. In this speech, he promised he would investigate the crimes of the previous administration and prosecute the corrupt. Quote, he would fill the penitentiary so full with them, these corrupt people, that their legs and arms will be sticking out the doors and windows. Now, he gave a speak at Louisburg in Conway County 4 days later and repeated these similar charges against the Clayton administration. But Clayton is in the audience. He's called up to speak after Brooks. Clayton gives his own speech, and he calls Clayton and his supporters, quote, as scurvy a set of knaves and thieves as ever plunged their hands into the public treasury and eluded the walls of the penitentiary, end quote. Also, thieves and scoundrels reeking with corruption. He charged them of being participants in corruption they were accusing his administration of, and he accused them of stealing $500,000 and nearly everything else in the state. Now, Clayton tells a fable also. He says there was once an old brindle bull which had been driving the small game into the lion's mouth by bellowing up and down. And in turn the lion permitted him to graze a little unmolested. But he shall not let the old brindle play his game any longer. In November we shall strip his hide off and hang it up for a warning, end quote. Clayton understood Brooks is going to be a formidable candidate, and he is going to have Clayton is going to have the support of the African Americans. Now, Clayton and his men know that they're going to be up against a challenge in Brooks, and Brooks is standing for universal suffrage, universal amnesty, and honest men in office. So Brooks has a strong appeal to many conservative Democrats. Now let's talk about Baxter. Elisha Baxter is a Batesville merchant. Now, the Clayton faction nominated Elisha Baxter to run for governor against Brooks. Baxter is a native of North Carolina, moved to Batesville in 1852, served 2 terms in the state legislature. He is a one-time Whig who opposed secession but supported Thomas Hindman, who's a rabid secessionist. And we talked about Hindman being assassinated in 1868. In 1862, when federal forces took Batesville, Baxter is offered a position in the Union Army but declines. When Confederate forces occupied the area, he leaves the state, flees to Missouri, begins working as a teacher, but is captured by Robert C. Newton, taken back to Little Rock, escaped, and went back to Missouri and takes a Union commission. He is taken to Little Rock to stand trial for treason. Now, when he is in prison in Little Rock, he is smuggled a key by one of his fellow inmates' wives, and he escapes north, surviving on just whatever he could forage, corn, berries. He takes the commission at that time in the Union Army and raises his own cavalry regiment. After raising his cavalry regiment, he participates in the rest of the war. After the fall of Little Rock, Baxter served the Murphy government as a member of the state Supreme Court and is later elected to the Senate, though he is not seated. Okay, we mentioned him earlier in this lecture. Clayton appointed him a judge of the 3rd District. Now, Baxter's supporters were called the Minstrels. One of his supporters was a member of a minstrel troupe before the war, so that's where that comes from. Now, the Brindle Tails are the liberal faction. So let's talk about the election of 1872. In this election, we're going to see Brooks versus Baxter. Now, in the newspapers, 12 Republican and 9 Democratic papers supported Brooks. 3 Republican and 14 Democratic papers supported Baxter. One said, quote, that carpetbagger Brooks ran with Democratic and scalawag supporter against a scalawag nominated by a party composed almost exclusively of carpetbaggers was enough to bewilder most voters as well as the modern student. This is Michael Dugan from the Arkansas Odyssey in 94. So, trying to just describe the whole situation. Now, people are split on who to support. And Brooks and Baxter, both members of the same political party, they were also both Methodist. Now, Baxter could not match Brooks' oratory skills. Baxter and his party, however, had control of the election machinery. The election was full of fraud, intimidation, and stuffed ballot boxes. And the returns from 4 counties are declared invalid and thrown out. In Lincoln, Perry, Van Buren, and Arkansas counties, a number of votes are disqualified. In some of these counties, Baxter won 465-0 because of these disqualifications. In Jefferson County, 400 Baxter votes are disqualified. So if it had not been for all of that, who knows how things may have turned out. But the official returns have Baxter winning 41,681 in a narrow victory to Brooks's 38,415. Regular Republicans retained control of the state legislature, and the Brooks forces were convinced they were cheated here. If the votes had been accurately counted, they would have had 43,992 to 43,394, and they claimed they would have actually won by 1,500 votes. The official results stand, however. Brooks and his forces tried to go through the legislature, but it was controlled by the Baxter faction. They then went to the Supreme Court, which was headed by John McClure, former Clayton ally and appointee, and now a Brooks supporter. The court denied Brooks's claim. Brooks filed a complaint against Baxter in a Pulaski County Circuit Court, saying that Baxter usurped the governor's office without legal authority. In March of 73, that year, an amendment is put to voters to restore voting rights to former Confederates. It passes overwhelmingly. Arkansas was the last state to do this. That's just kind of also what's going on. Now, Baxter gives a brief inaugural, reaching out to all parties. He hoped his election would bring, quote, a new era of peace and good feeling in Arkansas, end quote. He also appealed to a swift end to the disenfranchisement of all former Confederates. He appointed Democrats, conservatives, and liberals to government positions. In the special election in November of 1873, with restrictions removed, Democrats and conservatives are now set to reemerge as a potent political force, okay? So Democrats filled almost all empty positions in the new legislature. Baxter appointed regular and liberal Republicans as well as some Democrats to government positions. I mentioned it seemed for a time, because he's doing things like that for the first time, really, things are going well in Reconstruction. But Brooks had been deserted by many of his former supporters. And Baxter begins to alienate himself from his base, and this develops that schism that we've been talking about, right? Or furthers it, rather. It alienates former Governor Clayton. Now, Powell Clayton and Stephen Dorsey are concerned about the prospect that the new state legislature would try to put a new constitution in place. The last constitution created in 1968. Baxter said he would not issue any more railroad bonds, and that many that had been issued were unconstitutional. They've been issued under the Clayton administration. Now, Clayton and Dorsey are heavily invested in these bonds, so they turn on Baxter and throw their support to Brooks. So in 1874, the case is brought up again before the Pulaski County Circuit Court, and they make the ruling that Brooks is the legitimate governor in Arkansas. So April 15th to May 15th, 1874, for 1 month, the Brooks-Baxter War will ensue. Brooks and a dozen armed men showed up to the State House, forcibly evict Baxter from the governor's office, and the conflict begins. Now, the Brooks-Baxter War takes place around the State House. Main Street is really the dividing line and is controlled by federal troops who are trying to keep these warring factions apart. It also takes part around the Anthony House. That is where the government in exile will set up. Now, Baxter chose Robert C. Newton to lead his militia. Baxter mobilized the militia when he heard they were about to get dumped. Now, Newton had captured Baxter in Missouri previously and brought him back to Arkansas and tried him for treason, so a little bit of irony there. Brooks also has a militia. It is led by former Confederate Colonel James Fagan and former Union General Robert Catterson. Earthworks and a cannon are put up in front of the Capitol. This cannon now sits at Lone Oak Courthouse. This is the cannon that was used in Little Rock in the conflict by Brooks' forces. Brooks sent an aide to St. Louis to purchase guns and ammunition. They were shipped to Little Rock in small boxes labeled whiskey or Arkansas State Reports. Baxter forces began fortifying the Anthony House and brought in several small artillery pieces as well as one large artillery piece, a 64-pounder, that now sits on the lawn of the old State House, named Lady Baxter. This is a large piece that was salvaged from the riverbank that had been used during the war. Now, the Brooks-Baxter War affects all constituents in the state, but particularly those centered around Little Rock. Now, let's bring up now Hercules King Cannon White. He's a Kentucky native. He was born in 1845. He leaves home at the age of 15 and fights in the Civil War as a Confederate guerrilla. He comes to Pine Bluff to live with relatives, served as a private tutor, studied the law, got his law license. In 1874, at 28 years old, with red hair and freckles, he married in Pine Bluff and aligned himself with Pal Clayton. His wife was a granddaughter of ex-Governor Roane, and he married shortly after the surrender of the Confederacy. He was a prosecuting attorney in his district, appointed by Clayton. He becomes highly thought of and regarded by African Americans in Pine Bluff. Now, when this Brooks-Baxter War breaks out, Hercules King Cannon White aligns himself with Baxter. He raises 3 companies of troops, and in April, they stream from Pine Bluff to Little Rock. 2 days later, another 500 black men arrive by steamboat to reinforce Baxter. White citizens from Pope and Johnson counties show up to lend their support as well. Now, White turned out his command accompanied by a brass band with a parade that ended in front of the Anthony House. Baxter came out on the balcony and addressed the troops with a speech. And many of these troops in the audience don't have guns. It's worth noting. Federal troops move into the area. One of the federal troops on horseback bumps into a band member. And in the chaos that ensues, one person is shot and killed in the audience. There's potential for this episode to have been much worse. White and blacks both volunteered for Brooks, and both white and blacks both volunteered for Baxter. Now, White is involved in one real battle of the war. It took place in New Gascony near Pine Bluff. 2 groups of African Americans, both led by white officers, one of which is Hercules King Cannon White, and White's forces prevail. Both Brooks and Baxter factions are still gathering arms, ammunition, and men. Brooks' forces also had a victory. There's a rumor of a shipment of arms coming down the Arkansas from Fort Smith to reinforce Brooks' people. And Baxter forces send the steamboat the Halley at Palarm. This is a bend in the river between Little Rock and Conway. And at the bend, Brooks' forces are preparing for an ambush. They fire on the steamboat. Captain is killed. One of the pipes bursts, and the boat loses power and floats down the river and surrenders. So this brings some prominent political figures into the fray. Augustus Garland, who we mentioned a couple of times, and U.M. Rose. But both these men know Baxter. And also Robert Ward Johnson, former Confederate senator, and Albert Pike are also backing Baxter's cause and urging President Grant to intervene. And Grant is criticized previously for doing this other gubernatorial election in Louisiana. So let's go into the conclusion of this conflict. The Brooks-Baxter War will come to an end when President Grant became convinced he had to do something. He made a statement declaring Baxter to be the legitimate governor. He ordered Brooks' forces to disband and give up control of the capital. He, however, tries to cushion this by making Brooks the postmaster at Little Rock. Now, the war had ended 1 month after it had begun, and he declined running in the next election. So in June of 1874, voters go to the polls to decide whether to create a new constitution. First statewide elections are held since the end of restrictions of former Confederates. 80,000 vote for a new constitution, 8,000 against, and there are 91 delegates. Democrats won 70 of these delegate positions. Now, in 1874, the new Constitution passes at last to this day, 2020, and it is created as a reaction against the Republican Reconstruction Constitution of 1868. Governor terms, power, and salary are all reduced. The governor can veto an act, but it can be overridden by a simple majority. This is all under the Constitution of 1874. Most state offices are elected rather than appointed. The state power to tax is severely limited, but all of this passes overwhelmingly. The ratification vote produced the largest voter turnout in state history, and the new Constitution is ratified by a 3-1 majority. Republicans did not put forward any candidates for state officers. The new state Senate has 31 Democrats and 2 Republicans. The new House has 80 Democrats and 10 Republicans. Now, Democratic dominance will last throughout the 20th century. Governors in Arkansas after the Brooks-Baxter conflict were all former Confederates. Augustus Garland, the 11th governor, William Miller, Thomas Churchill, James Berry, Simon Hughes, James Eagle. Miller was a former Confederate state auditor, Garland, former senator, Thomas Churchill, former Confederate major general, Berry, second lieutenant, Simon Hughes, lieutenant colonel, James Eagle, lieutenant colonel. So the end of the Brooks-Baxter War really brings about an end to Reconstruction in Arkansas. And this is going to also lead the return to power of the conservative Democratic element in the state, and they will continue to hold this for over 100 years. So for African Americans, their hopes for full economic and political equality would have to wait for a second Reconstruction, which would come in the 1950s and 1960s. All right. Thanks for listening. That is it for this lecture on the Reconstruction in Arkansas. Thank you.